The imposing and awe-inspiring figure of a winged beast, often the dream of any adventurer, stands majestically before them, commanding the entire space around it. A dragon, with two large and prominent horns on each side of its sharp head, as well as colorful eyes that emit a mysterious light, is capable of freezing even veteran adventurers with its soul-penetrating gaze. Unlike common images in books and legends that often depict dragon scales as sparkling jewels with bright colors, this dragon's scales were pitch black and opaque, displaying dark shades that created faint gray shadows all around. The dragon looks like a legendary creature that transcends the limits of power and beauty, exhibiting an aura of incomparable sovereignty and ferocity. However, while the sight of this stunning dragon was capable of mesmerizing anyone, there was something far more terrifying affecting everyone around it. Beneath the dragon's shadow stood a boy who stole the show. The boy had blonde hair that fell in an orderly yet natural-looking manner and wore a uniform that was very recognizable to everyone. Every step he took showed a subtle but powerful confidence, like a hidden power ready to explode at any moment. The rage emanating from him created an almost physical effect, as if the air around him began to recoil and tremble from the intensity of the energy he emitted. It was as if the earth beneath him would collapse just because of his presence. The boy's name was Arthur Lewin, who now stood with a proud and unwavering stance. The atmosphere around them was eerily quiet and tense. Even the mindless creatures controlled by Dreniv seemed to know instinctively to bow and keep their distance. Lucas, who was observing the situation with sharp and calculating eyes, chuckled as he directed his steps towards Arthur, who was once considered an equal opponent. The dragon behind Arthur let out a deafening roar that echoed throughout the area, causing the surrounding spectators to grimace in fear and feel a tension that could almost be cut with a knife. Despite this, Lucas remained calm and showed no signs of discomfort. To him, it was not the dragon that caused discomfort, but Arthur's very existence. Although Arthur showed no reaction to Lucas' taunts, he continued to stride forward towards Lucas with an almost cold calmness. Several students had managed to defeat Dreniv's minions, leaving only a few monsters remaining on Lucas' side. However, these monsters seemed to be frozen in fear, unclear whether the fear was caused by Arthur's presence or by the dragon following him. As Arthur drew closer, Lucas realized that Arthur never looked at him at all. Arthur's gaze was not directed at him at all, which made Lucas feel stunned and as if he was being blatantly ignored. This sense of abandonment was increasingly stinging and disturbing, as if his entire existence was not important. Lucas felt that he could have easily defeated Arthur if Arthur had only begged him and his friends for mercy. Instead, Arthur showed the audacity to ignore Lucas, adding to Lucas' anger. Lucas' fists clenched so tightly that his fingers turned white, showing how angry he was. Arthur strode past everyone he knew with no regard for them, whether they were seriously injured or dead, and knelt directly in front of the elf princess. Her dragon also craned its neck in a gentle gesture towards Arthur, as if to pay his respects or protect him from harm. A moment of silence fell over the situation, creating a tense and suspenseful atmosphere. Arthur ignored Lucas completely and walked towards the unconscious Tessia. Tessia's smooth, pale skin looked bruised and scratched, but the wounds were only superficial, nothing too serious. Tessia seemed to have been drugged into unconsciousness for a while. Arthur felt that it was for the better, so that Tessia would not have to witness what he was about to do. He asked Sylvie to look after and protect Tessia, and assured his bond that she was quite capable of handling the situation without additional help. Lucas, who witnessed all this, felt a deep sense of anger and disappointment. He knew exactly what to do, and his lips curled into a satisfied grin. Lucas tried to tease Arthur by saying that Tessia was crying for him, but Arthur did not give any reaction. Lucas continued his commentary by saying that Tessia had remained strong in the beginning, and it made him even more satisfied to see Tessia break down emotionally. Lucas was annoyed and frustrated by Arthur, who continued to hug Tessia without saying a word, as if all of Tessia's suffering meant nothing to Arthur. Lucas roared angrily, accusing Arthur of daring to ignore him and threatening to break every bone in Arthur's body and defile Teshia. However, Lucas' words caught in his throat when the ground beneath Arthur suddenly cracked and crumbled, making Lucas stumble and nearly fall. Arthur remained calm and careful, gently laying Teshia back on the ground without causing any further damage. Lucas felt the sensation of a cold and emotionless grip gripping his insides, making it difficult for him to breathe, and feeling oppressed by the power exuded by Arthur. Lucas' body trembled uncontrollably, feeling the immense emotional and physical weight. When Arthur turned around, the simple eye contact between him and Lucas made Lucas feel a deep sense of dread. Arthur's pale blue eyes, sharp as knives, made the air feel sucked out of Lucas' lungs. Lucas felt as if his strength should have been greater than Arthur's, but the deep, unparalleled feeling of fear overcame him. Lucas realized clearly that although in theory he should be stronger, this feeling was disturbing and frightening, overshadowing all his remaining confidence. Arthur approached determinedly, his blue eyes blazing with a storm of anger and desire to create chaos that enveloped the atmosphere. In his view, Lucas was simply an obstacle to be overcome, a threat that could not be allowed to exist any longer. Lucas Wykes, the second son of Otis Veher Wykes, was widely known as the man who had brought the elite wizards of Tyrus Academy to their knees before him. Arthur will not allow himself to admit his fear, even if it means facing death rather than asking for mercy for his life. He was determined to destroy Lucas and end the threat that lay before him. Arthur felt that the biggest mistake of his life was letting Lucas continue to live all this time. Every step towards Lucas felt like a burning impulse, energizing him to overcome the threat before him. His head throbbed in time to the rapid heartbeat, each pulse reminding him of a determination that could not be extinguished. Nothing was more important now than overcoming the threat before him, and Arthur knew that he could not fail. On the other hand, Lucas, with a crazed look in his eyes, retreated while preparing his spell. He seemed unaware that the spell he was preparing was actually harming himself. With each movement, Lucas showed more and more indifference to the dangers that might arise from the power of his spell. Arthur knew that he had to act quickly before Lucas killed himself with the increasing power of his spell. Lucas finally unleashed the spell, sending dozens of fireballs scattering into the air, each one getting bigger and brighter with time. The originally red fireballs turned blue as Lucas perfected his magic. Lucas' body seemed to wither under the constant weight of his spell, as if the power he was using was draining his vital energy. Arthur realized that Lucas was intent on destroying not only himself, but also most of the school with the destructive power being unleashed. Arthur felt that although he could let Lucas kill himself with his own spell, such a death would be too cruel for him. Arthur needed Lucas alive, at least until he got answers to everything that happened. With strengthened resolve, Arthur was determined to destroy Lucas immediately, but he knew that such an attack could not have been carried out by Lucas alone. It was possible that someone had forced Lucas to use his mana core to the point of near death. Lucas' skin color and mana changes were too suspicious not to be related to Virtuous. Arthur activated the second phase of his magic, and his sight turned monochrome. Only particles of mana could be detected around him. By activating the Absolute Zero ability, the air around him seemed to freeze instantly, forming a curtain of white fire that protected him from Lucas' spell rain. Arthur realized that there was not much time left in this second phase before the attack retreated, and he needed answers before this phase ended. As the cloud of vapor and debris began to dissipate, Arthur saw Lucas' shocked expression replace the crazed look that had previously graced his face. Lucas looked utterly shocked and incredulous at the drastic change in Arthur. In confusion and shock, Lucas began to cast a new spell, with the amount of mana accumulated in his hands appearing much more powerful than the previous spell. The accumulated mana manifested into a blue partisan spear that blazed with menacing energy. Lucas threw the flaming spear with the intention of destroying Arthur, an attack filled with intensity and hatred. However, Arthur, with unwavering composure, shot a stream of electricity from his right hand to deflect the attack. Meanwhile, his left hand caught the shaft of Lucas' spear, and his arm was jerked backwards by the immense power of the spear. The hiss of the cloud of vapor formed by the mesh of fire and ice echoed around him, creating a tense and gripping atmosphere. Lucas whimpered in pain as Arthur continued to close in on him. He could be seen pawing at the empty space where his left arm used to be, realizing the extent of the damage. Arthur muttered to himself, his left hand blazing in pearl-colored flames that radiated an extremely cold temperature. With less than a foot away from Lucas, Arthur continued to approach, ready to continue his attack. Arthur knew that Lucas's mana was flowing into his body in a very suspicious way, just like it did to Vritra. The fire in his left hand began to spread, slowly freezing Lucas' arm down to its molecules, causing deep pain. Arthur's grip tightened until his arm shattered like glass. Lucas, with eyes full of horror and helplessness, watched as the shattered fragments of his left arm fell apart. Arthur showed no mercy. Calmly, he shattered the rest of Lucas' arm, which now fell in small fragments to the ground. Lucas lay on the ground, spitting and whimpering in excruciating pain. Arthur kicked him viciously in the back, staring at Lucas with a glare full of burning hatred. Placing a foot on Lucas' right leg, Arthur clamped down hard on it, causing stinging pain. Lucas was no longer a human being with compassion. With a scream filled with pain, Lucas vomited blood, and his leg crumbled into a crimson-colored mess. Bone shards dotted the pool of blood that seeped through the cracks in the ground due to the increased gravitational force from Arthur's leg. The sound of crunching broken bones echoed in the atmosphere, followed by a shrill howl of pain as Arthur did the same to the other leg. Arthur felt that this action was appropriate for someone so vile, just like how Vritra had left Alia lifeless. Grabbing Lucas by the scruff of the neck, Arthur slapped his face to get Lucas' attention, demanding information about who was responsible for all this. When Lucas' eyes met Arthur's, his expression turned into a scowl before he spat in Arthur's face with deep hatred. In this chaos, Arthur realized just how much he was worried about Tessia, to the point where he overlooked the fact that Elijah was also involved in this matter. Looking around, Arthur realized that many students and professors were peering from afar, with obvious expressions of fear, watching the chaos unfold with worry and distress. Arthur Lewin felt a terrible pounding as his foot, filled with deadly mana, slammed into Lucas' pelvis. The impact of the strike created an explosion of broken bones, crumbling flesh, and shattering gravel, accompanied by a shrill scream that deafened and broke the silence of the night. At this point, Lucas, who had been an accomplice to the doom and death that led Arthur to this point, was now just a badly injured and dying body. His mouth was foaming. Only the whites of his eyes were clearly visible through the dimness. Lucas continued to mumble incoherently, as if his last consciousness was hovering among the remnants of his life. Arthur lifted his feet from the blood-soaked mess, relieved that Tess, who had been the target of this disaster, had finally fallen asleep without further impact. The disaster that engulfed them finally seemed to be over, with the perpetrator who had killed 3 professors and was responsible for many other deaths, now seriously injured and slowly approaching the end of his life. However, the atmosphere around did not reflect any sense of relief or triumph. The fear that was in the eyes of everyone, both students and staff, replaced the relief that should have accompanied the end of this fight. Tension enveloped the entire area, creating an oppressive and anxiety-filled atmosphere. Arthur, who had not received this kind of fearful gaze for a long time, felt a mixture of deep satisfaction and discomfort. He was proud of the strength he had used to defeat his enemy, but now a helpless sigh only escaped his lips, signaling deep exhaustion. A searing pain spread throughout Arthur's body, like a flame devouring all the energy and strength he had left. He was forced out of the second phase of his magic, which had given him immense power, but also had severe consequences. His hair, once silvery white and long, was now shortened to a more natural brownish blonde. The tattoos running down her arms and back were fading, signaling the end of the second phase of the magic and the return of normal vision, though her eyesight still felt strained. The retreat this time was much less than against the Elderwood guards, and although Arthur didn't faint, his mana usage felt very inefficient. He had forced himself to use gravity magic, which made him even more tense and tired. As Arthur struggled to keep his body from falling, a sharp ring of energy suddenly interrupted, drawing the attention of Arthur and everyone around him. The red barrier that had surrounded the school all this time shattered from above, with fragments flying down. The shards reflected the light of the Aurora constellation that was almost in full bloom in the night sky, transforming the blood-soaked academy instantly into a fairy tale-like scene. Among the shimmering rain of barrier fragments, 3 figures descended. Before Arthur could even figure out their identities, the terrifying pressure they exuded already gave a clear hint of who they were. They were the Lances. With Arthur's attention completely focused on the Lances, he did not realize that Lucas, who was in a dying state, had gained enough consciousness to speak. With what little strength he had left, Lucas looked up at the Lances and uttered one word, "Big Brother," which expressed their connection in a very clear way. Before Arthur could respond or react to Lucas' words, a wave of light suddenly struck him in the chest. This wave shot towards the bell tower with tremendous force, breaking through the wall reinforced by mana and buried under the ruins. Arthur felt like his chest was hit by a crushing force, and blood began to vomit from his mouth. It felt like his intestines were being squeezed, and he struggled to pull himself out of the situation, but his body felt like it was tightly clamped against the wall. Dazed and pinned down, he tried to see with blurred vision, and it turned out that the person who cast the spell was one of the Lances. Although Arthur could only see his vague figure, before the Lance could unleash another attack, Arthur saw Sylvie unleash a blast of fire at him. However, Arthur's shout to Sylvie went unheard, as Sylvie faced the blast like a toy ball before one of the other Lances trapped Sylvie in an ice dome. Although every bone in Arthur's body felt like it was being sawn in half and his head felt like it was being stabbed repeatedly, he could slightly understand what was happening around him. From his slightly curved body shape and long white hair, the Lance who had trapped Sylvie in the ice cage was female. Sylvie, despite her struggles, seemed unable to break or melt the ice cage. Despite her unfavorable position, Arthur felt a little relieved that Sylvie was only trapped, compared to the other options that Lance might have chosen. Meanwhile, Lance, who had attacked Arthur, was now kneeling beside Lucas. His fairly young figure, probably in his late 20s, clearly bore a striking resemblance to Lucas, from his straight, pointed nose to his slanted eyes. The last Lance, who was much older, immediately began to gather and organize the remaining students and professors. He interrogated a few students, nodding in response to their explanations and occasionally turning to Arthur. Arthur, in his deep confusion and nagging worry about Sylvie, finally realized that Lucas had called the Lance who attacked him brother. Before Arthur could curse his bad luck, the Lance who was called Lucas' brother charged towards him, while his body emitted a burst of yellow lightning. The Lance spoke in a calm yet clearly alarming tone, as if speaking directly into Arthur's ears. A storm of electricity surrounded Lance's body, dancing around like a restless cobra, circling Arthur as Lance walked toward him. Arthur tried to move his body, but after a few struggles, he realized that his body had been crucified to the wall by something that looked like electromagnetism. Despite this situation, Arthur couldn't help but marvel at Lance's control over the lightning. The lightning seemed to simply bend and dance to Lance's will, with no need for special concentration to manipulate it. Shifting his gaze towards Sylvie, who was still struggling hard to escape the ice cage, and back to the lightning-clad Lance, Arthur finally realized the abilities of the White Core Mage. The older Lance, Ulfred, ordered Baron not to touch Arthur. Baron, who looked confused and annoyed, turned his head to look back. Although Baron surrounded himself with lightning, Ulfred reminded Baron that Arthur was the one who had saved everyone from the threat of Baron's brother. Ulfrid emphasized that Beren had no right to make decisions and must obey the council's orders. Arthur tried to take advantage of this opportunity to return to the second phase, hoping to gather enough strength to escape. However, his efforts were in vain. His body was not even capable of gathering mana at that moment. Seeing Beren, who looked confused, Arthur decided to defend with great pride. Just as Beren was about to attack Arthur, two pitch-black knights appeared from the ground beside him, pinning him down firmly. Beren roared and struggled in the clutches of the two knights, but his struggles were in vain. Beren then unleashed a shockwave, which shattered both stone knights before striking Ulfrid with lightning that gathered around his hands, turning into crackling spears. Ulfrid, with his entire right arm turned into hardened lava, was ready for the attack. However, before the two could exchange blows, a female lance appeared between them. The female lance that had previously trapped Sylvie in an ice cage now turned its attention away from Sylvie and moved quickly towards Ulfrid and Beren. With agile movements and surprising speed, the female lance used her ice magic to create a strong ice barrier, blocking all the lightning attacks thrown by Beren. Meanwhile, a beam of soft blue light encircled her body, amplifying the power of her ice magic, adding to the chilling and calming impression that accompanied her presence. When the female lance positioned herself between Ulfrid and Beren, her gaze was sharp and determined. Her cold, emotionless facial expression reflected indifference to internal strife and determination to focus on the main goal. The female lance's voice, when speaking, filled the air with a calm yet firm tone, as if every word that escaped her lips carried the weight of a heavy threat. In this tense atmosphere, she emphasized the importance of putting aside internal conflicts to focus on bigger issues. Beren, despite his anger and frustration at the stifling of his anger, realized that the situation they were facing was far more important than personal conflicts. With a deep frown, he lowered his hand that was still glistening with lightning. The lightning slowly faded, signaling the difficulty in controlling his emotions amidst the worsening situation. Beren averted his gaze from Ulfrid and the female lance, as if his inner voice whispering about the urgency of their mission made him understand the more pressing priorities. On the other hand, Arthur, who was being squeezed by the electromagnetism force suffocating his body, felt the intensity of the pain increasing. Every breath felt like a stabbing needle, and he fought hard to stay conscious amidst the unbearable pain. Arthur was paying close attention to the movements and interactions between the powerful witches, trying to find an opening to escape or at least gather more information about the ongoing situation. Sylvie, who was in the ice cage, was trying hard to resist with all the strength she had left. She tried to melt the ice that held her, every muscle in her body straining in a maximum effort to break free from the icy prison. Sylvie's loud and determined voice tried to reach Arthur, though it was not clearly heard amidst the commotion. She sent encouragement to Arthur to not give up and fight his way out of the situation. Arthur responds with what strength he has left, trying to shout words of encouragement despite his weak and indistinct voice. He prayed that Sylvie could find a way to free herself and that they could both face the approaching threat with the strength they had left. Arthur's belief that Sylvie still possessed immense strength provided some hope in the midst of this grim situation. Meanwhile, Ulfrid, who had begun to gather concentration seriously, showed a thoughtful expression. He observed the situation carefully, realizing that although the lance had overcome the threat from Beren, an even greater challenge might still await them. With great care, Ulfrid directed his right hand that had turned into lava towards the shattered barrier wall, easing the damage that had been done and ensuring that the area around them remained safe from further threats. Ulfrid's every move showed great care and vigilance. Although Ulfrid was managing the situation carefully, the tension in the air suggested that a bigger threat might still be out there. The remaining students and professors, in a state of confusion and fear, could only wait and hope that this situation would soon improve. They hoped that this chaos would end soon, and they could resume their lives in peace. In the midst of this tense situation, Arthur decided to focus on recovering his strength and strategy for the next battle. He realized that although they had dealt with most of the threats, There was still much to be done to ensure everyone's safety and tackle any bigger problems that might arise in the future. Less than an hour after the incident, Lances had gathered enough information from witnesses to uncover the true events. This gave Arthur the opportunity not to be electrocuted by Baron. Instead, his feet and hands were shackled with ice cuffs. During this time, Arthur managed to make it known that Nayatu was his bond. For the first time since their meeting, there was a change of expression on Baron's face. A slight nod of his left eyebrow indicated a response. Baron immediately freed Sylvie from the cage and bound her with the same shackles as Arthur. After leaving Arthur, who was guarded by one of the knights summoned by Alfred, Baron and Lance Foray attempted to destroy the barrier around the school. Meanwhile, the elder Lance gathered all the students and professors with the help of 10 additional knights he summoned. Arthur couldn't help but admire the barrier covering the academy. The barrier was very well designed. It allowed access in but restricted everyone from exiting, as well as forcing the Lances to destroy the barrier first, indicating a high probability of restrictions on who was allowed in. While Tess and all the other captives were still unconscious, a team of mages from the Adventurers Guild and the Magicians Guild soon arrived at the scene. They immediately provided treatment to everyone in need and brought the injured to the medical facility. The atmosphere around the academy became chaotic. Sobbing families of the students involved, angry reporters taking notes in their notebooks, and noisy bystanders gathered around the academy's front gate, hoping to get more information about the incident. Luckily, both guilds had taken measures to prevent people from approaching the academy. Gates erected around the perimeter of the campus prevented anyone from entering without permission, with uniformed guards stationed every few meters. Forced to wait for further instructions, Arthur stayed near the female Lance to avoid a surprise attack from Baron. When he heard shouts of "Arthur" in the distance, he turned his head and saw his family waving from behind the gate. Even from this distance, there was obvious concern on his parents' faces, with his father trying to jump over the gate but being held back by one of the guards. Arthur also saw his younger sister crying while holding her mother's arm, while Vincent and Tabitha seemed to be looking for their daughter. Arthur made a request to speak with his family to the female Lance, his voice sounding much weaker than he expected. Baron immediately responded in a snide tone, accusing Arthur of feeling entitled to make the request after his actions towards his brother. However, Alfred interrupted and stated that he would escort Arthur to his family. Having no strength or freedom to move, Arthur was carried by Alfred to the front of the family. Placed in front of the family, Alfred stood behind Arthur, turning him around whether out of courtesy or out of caution against a possible attack from Baron. Arthur did not care. There was a tense moment of silence as his family stared at him wordlessly. The filthy condition of Arthur's body, with dried blood pooling around his mouth and shirt, and the tattered clothes, made him look like a homeless man who had just preyed on someone. Arthur tried to smile at his family, but their expressions showed even more concern. His mother extended her hand over the fence, and Arthur grasped it tightly. His father asked how Arthur was, looking worried with a frown on his forehead, while Arthur tried to reassure his mother that he was fine despite his worst days. Arthur turned his gaze to Ellie, his younger sister, who was still looking at him with an expression confused between anger, sadness, and relief. When his father asked why he was handcuffed, Arthur found it difficult to explain without revealing that he might be investigated. While searching for the right words, Arthur saw the female Lance approaching with a roll of paper in her hand. He stood up awkwardly because of the shackles binding his legs to face the female Lance. Without making eye contact, the female Lance began to read aloud from the scroll, stating that the council decided that, due to the excessive acts of violence and the inconclusive circumstances involved, her Manhwa would be detained, her title as a witch would be stripped, and she would be imprisoned until further judgment. The frowning sound as she rolled up the communication scroll echoed in Arthur's mind, clearly audible amidst the crowd of people gathered around her. The female Lance finally looked up and looked at Arthur. After the female Lance announced her decision, 3 different reactions emerged from the people around. The first reaction came from those who did not know the situation in depth. They stared in confusion, trying to match my appearance with the information readout, excessive violence, and inconclusive circumstances. Their doubts were apparent as they tried to understand how a teenage boy could cause the council to make such a decision instead of the city governor. The second reaction comes from a group of people who blindly worship the council and all forms of authority. They accepted the decision without hesitation, taking it as absolute truth. They looked at me with curse-filled gazes, believing that I was responsible for all the bad events in the academy. Their hateful whispers could be heard clearly, even though I was far away from the crowd. The third reaction came from the students and faculty involved in the incident, especially from my family. They cried out in protest, even though their voices were ignored by the female Lance. My family, being the closest to me, expressed their concern and anger clearly. My mother exclaimed from behind the fence, expressing her disbelief and demanding that the decision be corrected. My father also expressed doubts, convinced that there was another explanation behind all this. Some students who knew me chimed in, judging that I didn't deserve to be punished so severely. Amidst the chaos, Kathleen Glader appeared with anger clearly visible in her eyes. She walked towards me, expressing her deep anger and disappointment. Nonetheless, the female Lance quickly interjected, explaining that the decision involved the votes of important people such as Kathleen's parents and the king and queen of the Graysenders. Before Kathleen could approach any further, her brother held her back, and although she eventually relented with a red face and trembling body, she still couldn't influence female Lance's decision. I realized that no matter how hard I tried to persuade the female Lance, she would not change her decision. I asked for permission to talk to my family one last time before being taken away. The female Lance nodded briefly in agreement. I again approached the place where my parents stood behind the fence. We stared at each other in silence for a few seconds, not knowing how to start the conversation. I tried to smile broadly, trying to mask my uncertainty and assure them that everything would be fine once this misunderstanding was resolved. However, I couldn't help but worry about Sylvie. The presence of a dragon on our continent was something that could not be ignored. My face definitely showed doubt as I focused on my thoughts. My parents' expressions turned to shock and fear as they saw my condition. My mother clasped my hand through the fence with deep worry, while my father showed the same anxious expression. My sister, Ellie, looked very pale and was trying hard to hold back tears. I knelt down to be on the same level as my sister, staring at her childish face that now looked more mature than her actual age. One of my biggest regrets was not being able to be by her side as she grew up. I first met Ellie when she was 4 years old and was only with her for a few weeks. I hoped the next time I met her wouldn't be when she was a teenager or an adult. I stood back up, taking my eyes off Ellie, who was still tense. I assured them that I would definitely return home, even though tears had started to flow without them realizing it. The Lance named Alfred then used magic to lift me up with the help of a stone knight, while the female Lance separated Sylvie from her shackles and encased her in an enchanted ice ball. Baron, who had come with the corpse of his younger brother, Lucas, looked at me hatefully. He announced to the people that he would take a detour to bring Lucas' body to his family home for a proper burial. We left in a mood filled with tension and sadness. Arthur wasn't sure if the ability to fly was common for White Core mages, but the 3 lances carrying him, including the mage knight manning them, were able to fly without the need for spells. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the Cyrus Academy that was getting smaller and smaller as they flew away. The place didn't mean much to him, but the time he spent at the school located in the floating city of Tyrus as an ordinary wizard student left an impression. As the distance between himself and the academy grew, Arthur felt as if he was leaving behind his old life as an ordinary student. Their journey was conducted in silence, as all attempts to start a conversation had failed. Although they treated him gently, to them, Arthur was still a prisoner waiting to be judged. In her head, Sylvie cooed, voicing her concerns. Arthur replied silently, trying to calm Sylvie down with the belief that they would be fine. Although there was no immediate reply from Sylvie, Arthur could sense the emotions she was feeling: uncertainty, fear, and confusion. It was impossible to know exactly how far they had traveled south, as all that was visible below them were the great mountains that split the Decathan continent in two. The female lance escorting Arthur descended into the mountains, followed by Ulfred's lance and the stone knight who carried him. They landed in a small clearing at the edge of the great mountains overlooking the beast glades. Arthur, still chained, sat leaning against a tree as he watched Ulfred set up camp from the ground. Without waiting for a response, the female lance pressed an artifact against Arthur's sternum. Instantly, he felt mana flowing out of his core as the tool dug deeper into his skin. The sensation of mana being forcibly restrained was an unpleasant feeling. Arthur wondered why this sudden precaution was necessary if his magic would not help him escape. The female lance then carried the sleeping Sylvie into one of the stone huts that Ulfred had conjured. Arthur was upset, but he realized that they were very close to the beast glades. Ulfred explained that although he had never encountered a monster too powerful in the area, the beast glades held many mysteries to watch out for, especially at night when stronger monsters roamed. With all the strange events that had been happening lately, they had to remain cautious. While Ulfred seemed friendly, he was also very wary. Arthur couldn't glean any more information from him except what he could find on his own. Although they exchanged light-hearted words and tried to get clues from each other, there was a subtle tension between them. After an hour of futile efforts from both sides, Ulfred advised Arthur to sleep. True to the expectations of the lance, Ulfred was not kind enough to build a stone hut for Arthur like he did for himself and Veray. Without shelter and mana protection, the sharp wind made Arthur shiver with cold, so he tried to be as small as possible as he lay curled up against the tree. Arthur must have fallen asleep, because he was rudely awakened when a stone knight lifted him like a sack of rice. As he was brought back into the air, Arthur greeted the enchanted golem with indifference. He asked his bondmate, Sylvie, how she was doing. Sylvie responded that she was fine despite feeling a little stuffy inside the bond. As they flew over the beast glades, Arthur realized how vast their continent was, with diverse terrain from deserts, plateaus, snow-capped mountains, to rocky canyons. Several times he saw large animals that were clearly visible from where they were flying. Ulfred and Veray continuously unleashed waves of killing intent, keeping the mana monsters around them at bay. However, there were several occasions where they had to take a detour because the two lances attracted their aura. Arthur thought that Veray might have put a mana-limiting artifact on himself so as not to attract the attention of dangerous and territorial mana monsters. Although this was an action Arthur would probably take to escape, he was curious if he had the ability to survive in the beast glades. His internal debate didn't last long as Veray suddenly stopped. Veray took out a communication scroll to read the council's sentence before looking around carefully. He announced that they had arrived. As Arthur looked around, the only things visible around them were birds that were foolish enough to approach humans who could fly. Just as Arthur was about to express his opinion, Veray raised his hand as if searching for something in the air. With a soft click, the sky split open to reveal a metal staircase. Ulfred smiled at the sight of Arthur's gaping mouth, then said he had arrived at the council's floating castle. Lance Baron returned to the kingdom of Wykes with heavy steps, carrying Lucas' corpse that had been neatly wrapped in a white cloth. At the gate, the servants who were performing their duties were surprised to see Mr. Baron's arrival. Surprised yet enthusiastic, they welcomed him gladly, hoping to get some good news, or at least an update on the progress of Baron's assignment. However, their happiness soon turned into tension and anxiety when they realized the condition of the corpse Baron had brought. The worry deepened when they saw the grim expression on their master's face. In a state of confusion and shock, they wondered about the true state of affairs. However, Lance Baron, with a face full of anger and dissatisfaction, immediately ordered them to call his father, Wykes, immediately. Upon arriving at the spacious and majestic room where Wykes usually was, Lance Baron immediately faced his father's anger. Wykes, who was already waiting with a tense and dissatisfied expression on his face, immediately threw a fit in a very loud and angry tone. Full of frustration, Wykes declared that Lucas was a disgrace to the Wykes family. He was very disappointed and angry that Lucas had died in such a shameful way, even though he had given him everything that was best for him as a father. Wykes endlessly expressed his disappointment at all the effort he had put in, including every teaching, every core, and every elixir he had given Lucas. All of those efforts seemed to be wasted and meaningless in the face of such a disappointing end result. Wykes looked at his first son with an angry gaze, demanding an explanation as to why Baron had brought Lucas' corpse before him. In a tone full of anger and discontent, Wykes asked for the reason behind Baron's actions, which he considered an insult to their family. Baron, who felt that he had failed to take revenge on behalf of the Wykes family, now came with the body of the foolish Lucas, tainting a night that was supposed to be a time for contemplation and peace. Later, Wykes, who had lost his temper, wanted to hit Baron as a form of anger. However, Baron swiftly restrained his father's hand, trying to prevent further violence. He asked his father to restrain his anger and reminded him that he was a Lance, who should be treated differently. Wykes, hearing the request, removed his hand and sarcastically commented that since Baron had become a Lance, he had shown more and more arrogance and disrespect for his position. Wykes then reminded Baron that his Lance title was a result of their family status, that he was able to reach that position because he was a Wykes, not solely due to his own efforts and abilities. Wykes, with a facial expression filled with deep worry and anger, looked at Lance Baron with tension and asked about the events that had actually happened. Lance Baron, filled with deep anger and frustration, began to explain the situation that had occurred in thorough detail. He revealed that, based on the testimony of the witnesses, Lucas had committed a major offense by breaking into the protected area with the help of a cult group led by an individual named Dranavi. Lance Baron waved his hand angrily, emphasizing how brutal and without hesitation Lucas' assassin had been in carrying out his actions. He expressed in a tone full of emotion that the act was extremely cruel and unacceptable. In an atmosphere filled with tension and burning anger, Wykes, feeling unable to contain his rage, immediately called a woman named Adelina. Adelina, who was used to the routine and duties of the palace, immediately entered the room in a respectful manner, saying, "Yes, sir." Wykes, in a firm and commanding tone, asked Adelina to prepare and deliver a letter to the council that very night. In the letter, Wykes wanted detailed information about the unfortunate and shameful assault on Osiris. He ordered the letter to explain that Lucas, as his son, was under Dranavi's influence and had no choice but to obey Dranavi's orders if he did not want to face death. Wykes asserted that Lucas was a victim who died brutally at the hands of the barbarian blackguard, who were deemed unfit to live in their society. Therefore, Wykes stated that there was no other appropriate form of punishment than death for the crimes committed against the Wykes family. He hoped that the council would make an appropriate decision as they prepared for Lucas's funeral with honor and respect. After giving such clear and detailed instructions, Wykes turned to Baron with a sharp and dissatisfied look. In a tone full of stress and indifference, Wykes asked if this action he was taking was what Baron wanted. Lance Baron, who seemed to be still depressed and overwhelmed by emotions, did not give an adequate answer. Instead, he inquired about Lucas's funeral plans, hoping to get some reassurance regarding the process and procedures that would be followed. However, Wykes, in a nonchalant and indifferent manner, stated that he did not care about the funeral arrangements. He then ordered Adelina to handle all the preparations related to Lucas' funeral and told Baron to leave the room, without paying any further attention to his son's requests or concerns. His eyes remained fixed on the old and rusted iron staircase until the roar of the beast below shook him from his reverie. Chief Alfred turned to those in the surroundings, warning that it seemed that some of the sharper mana monsters had scented the castle's presence. He emphasized that they should hurry if they didn't want to encounter unnecessary trouble. From the sky, there were subtle movements of several large mana monsters hidden behind the trees. Vere only responded with a nod, showing neither disagreement nor approval, but accepting Ulfred's intentions. The stone knight who carried her on his shoulder gently lowered her to the bottom of the stairs before crumbling into sand and reshaping himself into a cloak that wrapped around Ulfred. Ulfred explained to them that dwarves always carry a bit of dirt with them wherever they go, while winking at the person who was surprised by the expression. As the door behind them closed, and he thought they would be surrounded by darkness, the moss-like substance covering the wall began to glow with a soft blue light. Vere removed the ice cuffs that shackled his legs so that he could walk alone, and took the lead while Ulfred followed close behind. They seemed to have been trudging for at least an hour up the seemingly endless stairs when annoyance rose from his mouth. She wondered if there wasn't a faster way to ascend other than climbing these nonsensical stairs. Although his body was probably stronger than most humans, even without a mana core due to the simulation process he had gone through, he still felt impatient with the wasted time. Vere replied that magic could not be used at all entrances. There was a hint of impatience in his already cold voice. She could only let out a deep breath and trudged on in silence. Peering down at her bonds, Sylvie seemed to be sleeping more than usual due to her recent change to draconic form. Winsome had explained the various forms Ashura could use depending on the situation, but the impact on Sylvie in releasing her draconic form was quite surprising. However, considering Sylvie was essentially a newborn in the eyes of the gods who lived for thousands of years, this was not surprising. Lost in her thoughts, she did not realize that Vere had stopped. When she bumped into Vere, she grunted in surprise. The woman's lance was slightly taller than him, but he was one step below her, so his face only hit Vere's back. However, the cuffed arm in front of her hit a more intimate area. Vere's reaction surprised her. She let out a rather effeminate little screech as she jumped forward. Turning to face her, Vere's face radiated embarrassment and surprise before turning into a terrifying look that could make one break out in a cold sweat. After gathering himself, Vere turned around and placed his hand on the end of the stairs before muttering under his breath that they had arrived. Ulfred only grinned amusedly before shrugging his shoulders and pushing him forward. A blinding light seeped through the gap in the split wall. As his eyes adjusted, he could finally see what lay ahead. A brightly lit corridor with a curved ceiling stretched from where they were, its walls filled with mysterious designs carved on every side and corner. The carvings made this corridor look more like a memorial carved with the names of the deceased than a fancy decoration. Each carving and design seemed to have a purpose and meaning. There were simple chandeliers hung from the ceiling every few meters. Although the hall was brightly lit, the white light exuded a cold and emotionless impression, reminiscent of a hospital in the old world. Vere whispered with an unusually cold tone to his voice as they entered through the rather crudely crafted door, warning against talking to them or any lance. They walked in silence, only the echo of their footsteps filling the hallway. On either side were doors of different colors and materials, all very different from each other. The corridors seemed to have no end, but Vere stopped them at a seemingly random door on the left. He knocked on the door without pause until it swung inward, revealing an armored bear. The guard immediately knelt down with his head bowed when he saw Vere. Vere asked the guard to stand up, and then told him to inform the council of their arrival. The guard stood back without making eye contact with either of the two lances, and his gaze rested curiously and cautiously on Arthur. After a few minutes, the guard returned and opened the door fully for them, allowing them to enter. He announced that Lance and Lance Balrog had been given permission to see the council, along with a prisoner named Arthur Lewin. Arthur looked at Ulfred and raised an eyebrow. As Ulfred walked past him, he muttered a code name, as if embarrassed. Arthur could only smile wryly before following behind the two lances. Whatever lay ahead would most likely determine his future, but all he could think about was the code names for all the other lances. As they passed the guards and stepped through the hidden door, Arthur immediately sensed a change in atmosphere. They were in a large circular room with a coffered ceiling that seemed to be made entirely of glaze. The room was simply decorated, with only a long rectangular table at the very back. 6 chairs, each occupied by one of the council members, faced the 3 of them. Each council member looked at Arthur with a different expression. Ulfred and Veray bowed to the council as the former kings and queens rose from their seats. Arthur, who didn't know what exactly custom dictated in a situation like this, followed the 2 lances and bowed as well. However, the former dwarf king, Dawsid Graysunders, with a bushy brown beard dangling from his chin, showed displeasure. Dawsid asked Arthur to kneel as a sign of respect, seeing Arthur as an equal to Lance, not as an individual. Arthur struggled to control his facial expression, but before he could reply, Alduin Erelith, Tesha's father and former elf king, shook his head with a worried expression. Arthur apologized, claiming to be a boy from the countryside uneducated in manners. Dawsid Graysunders ignored Arthur's apology and reminded everyone that they were here as leaders of the continent, not as parents. He read out a description of the atrocities Arthur committed against his schoolmates, mentioning the various acts of violence Arthur committed. Priscilla, the former queen, tried to defuse the situation, but Dawsid emphasized that even though Arthur had saved the entire school, that did not justify his horrible actions. Alduin Erelith came to Arthur's defense, explaining that while Arthur may have committed acts of revenge, he did what they could not in a time of need, and that was potentially save every student within Xyris. Alduin showed anger towards Dawsid's accusations and explained that Arthur's actions should be considered in a larger context. Meryl, the former dwarf queen, agrees with Alduin that Arthur is too dangerous to be left alone. She proposes that they simply incapacitate Arthur as a wizard, while her husband, Glaudera, agrees with this view. The discussion continues regarding the final decision on Arthur's fate, and their indifference towards Sylvie is mentioned directly, signaling that they see the danger posed by Sylvie's presence. Mrs. Tesha shook her head in confusion as she listened to the ongoing debate. She wondered if the leaders were listening to themselves, feeling that they sounded like paranoid criminals. In this situation, Priscilla revealed that she and her husband agreed with Muriel's views, especially as parents. However, she cautioned that the Graysunders' views should also be taken into consideration, given the grave consequences that could arise if they went against the entire continent. Alduin, feeling very angry, stood up and almost shouted, responding to the idea of paralyzing Arthur and killing Sylvie just because Arthur might have a grudge. He judged that such an action would make the situation worse, especially considering the potential for greater conflict that might arise. Dawsid, the former dwarf king, in a threatening tone, reminds Alduin of his position and his inability to manage his own lane. Dawsid accused Alduin in an accusatory tone, mentioning that the continent was on the brink of war, and that Alduin was careless to the point of losing one of their biggest trump cards. Arthur, who attempted to speak up and explain his position, didn't get the chance. Dawsid cut him off harshly, rejecting the claims Arthur was making and asserting that what Arthur said did not change the reality of his actions and the potential danger that existed if he was left alone. Dawsid emphasized that the scouts were still gathering information from witnesses. Glaudera, speaking for her husband, ordered that Arthur be locked up in one of the underground cells and his pets locked in the vault. Glaudera waved her hand, signaling that this decision was final and needed no further discussion. Alduin felt angry and growled, reminding her that this council should not be run according to their will. Behind Alduin, a masked figure knelt waiting for orders. The tension between Alduin and Dawsid was palpable, with the Fairy King and Dwarf King face to face in a stressful atmosphere. Alduin finally relented and sat back down reluctantly. Arthur, who was lifted up by the Stone Knight Alfred, met Alduin's gaze for a moment. From that gaze, Arthur could see the strong determination in Alduin and chose to remain silent. Arthur realized that the former Dwarf King and Queen seemed to want to cripple him, while Glaudera remained neutral due to incomplete information. Arthur felt dependent on Alduin and Muriel to ensure he and Sylvie could return home unharmed. As the stone knight carried Arthur through another door and lowered him down the stairs, Arthur tried to talk to Ulfred, but to no avail. This place looked like a typical castle dungeon, with cells for prisoners of war and traitors. Arthur was in one of the cells, surrounded by shadows that the light of the burning torches could not reach. Upon arriving at his cell, Arthur landed rather unimpressively on his knees and elbows as Ulfred closed the iron cage. Arthur felt disappointed that he hadn't been warned beforehand, but tried to shake the dust off his knees. Suddenly, Arthur heard a weak but very familiar voice. He raised his head and saw someone in the cell, and quickly recognized the voice as Director Goodsky. Arthur stood in his cell, surrounded by darkness illuminated only by the flickering flames of dancing torches. Just then, a voice from the opposite cell startled him. Director Goodsky, known for his position as director, was in the same cell. Arthur couldn't hide his surprise when he heard the name. Director Goodsky, who now no longer used the title due to being stripped of his position, expressed his pain through the sigh heard in his voice. Arthur's inability to see his surroundings due to the poor lighting only added to the frustration of the situation. Goodsky, in a tone full of anguish, expressed how unexpected their meeting in that place was. Arthur, curious about Goodsky's condition, wondered why the director was there. Leaning against the bars of the cage, he hoped to hear more clearly. Goodsky's cell was across from Arthur's, and the situation was exacerbated by inadequate flashlights, keeping most of the cell in darkness. Director Goodsky wanted to know how Arthur had come to be locked up, believing that Arthur's ability should be enough to take care of himself or even escape if necessary. Arthur explained that he was forced to use most of his mana to fight Lucas, who had taken Tessia captive. When the two lances appeared, Arthur did not have enough power to escape. Goodsky felt that he didn't fully understand the situation that had just occurred. It was no surprise that Goodsky was unaware of the events of the academy, as he would probably have come to help if he had known. Arthur provided as much information about the events as possible, hoping that Goodsky would understand the situation. Arthur explained that Lucas, who now had striking physical changes and greatly increased mana manipulation abilities, had a sickly, gray skin tone and dark lines that appeared to be his veins. Lucas' hair also changed from blonde to dusty black and white. Goodsky then showed his impatience and annoyance at not being able to clearly identify what was happening with the disaster leader. Goodsky felt depressed and frustrated at not being able to reveal more. He revealed that he was bound by forces that were beyond human ability to resist. His inability to speak further was due to the bonds that restricted his freedom. Goodsky was frustrated, but did not direct his anger at Arthur. Arthur realized that the reason Director Goodsky was locked up might be related to the fact that Goodsky was being scapegoated by the council as the reason for all the recent events. Goodsky could not reveal any further reasons for the board's need for a scapegoat, and Arthur could sense the deep frustration in Goodsky's voice. While Arthur tried to make sense of the situation, he mused about the possibility of escaping from the floating castle located at one of the deepest ends of the Beast Glades. With Sylvie's condition deteriorating and Goodsky unable to do much, Arthur felt that their escape plan might fail. Seeing that they would have to face the difficulty of flying over the Beast Glades, Arthur was frustrated. After hours of thinking and planning a seemingly impossible escape, Arthur was finally forced to give up and try sleeping on the cold floor. Despair and frustration engulfed him, while his mind continued to race to find a solution to this seemingly hopeless situation. Blaine Glader stood in his study, feeling a deep sense of anger and despair. The former dwarf king, Dawsid, had thrown a tantrum and slammed the door, leaving a tense atmosphere in the room. Dawsid demanded that Blaine abide by the agreement they had made, emphasizing that there were no future generations if Blaine did not side with him. Dawsid forced Blaine to admit that Arthur and his bond must be eliminated to ensure the future of the continent. Blaine coldly responded that although he understood the agreement, He could not issue baseless accusations against Arthur, who had just saved an entire future generation of the continent, including his own children. Blaine realized the gravity of the stakes and emphasized that their actions were a betrayal of the entire population. Dawson tried to comfort Blaine by saying that Dickethan would have been destroyed regardless of their efforts to save it, and that they should look further to protect what was important to them. Blaine was disgusted by the idea and judged that their actions left the people to save themselves. Dawson tried to convince Blaine that Dawson's promise was not a bad thing, and that Blaine's family would live and serve the promised party. Blaine inquired about the fate of the people of Dickethan, and questioned what would happen to them if other kingdoms, such as the kingdoms of Sapin and Darv, were not safe after they pledged allegiance to the promised side. Dawson, who regarded elves as archaic and self-righteous creatures, belittled Blaine's opinion and emphasized the great benefits that would be gained from the power and technology that the pledged side would bring. Blaine emphasized that he was following the promised party for the sake of his family, and not for personal gain. He implied the possibility of genocide or enslavement of other races that might occur if the promised party arrived. Dawson was silent, trying to refute but unable to come up with a strong argument. Although Blaine felt compelled to side with Dawson to save his Glader bloodline, he felt a deep sense of fear and guilt. He brooded in sadness and felt that the luxuries that surrounded him were nothing compared to his original purpose as a wizard. Blaine felt inferior because his talents as a wizard were not comparable to those of more talented people like Arthur. He felt a deep sense of envy and sadness at not being able to reach his desired standard. After brooding for an hour, Blaine realized that no amount of alcohol could remove the deep feelings that plagued him. In his drunken state, he fell down and a piece of glass hit his arm. He felt a deep sense of frustration and regret, cursing himself for not being able to overcome his inadequacies. Blaine got up and headed for his bedroom, ignoring the cut on his arm and the pain left by the broken glass. As he stepped into the bedroom, memories of Arthur came to mind. Although Arthur was not widely known at the time, Blaine had seen great potential in him and felt that Arthur's fate was a great one. Blaine felt guilt and despair, hoping that the decisions he made were for the good of the continent, even though his words felt empty and inadequate. He felt that the envy and hatred towards Arthur was a heavy burden to bear. With a deep sense of guilt and sadness, Blaine uttered a final apology to Arthur, realizing that all of this was for his own good, though he admittedly struggled to accept the fact.